Hello everyone, today we talk about the Holy Roman Imperial Artillery between the 15th and the 16th century. We're talking specifically about the Germanic Empire, the House of Habsburg, but also the Catholic League, any force that essentially fought, at least under a Catholic banner, in Germany. We do not extend this to other countries, not just for how these could be fielding coalition armies together with what was de facto a German regional state handed by the Habsburgs. We'll come back, by the way, on our series about early modern Habsburgic history that we began last autumn. Today we focus really on the technicalities of artillery, like just how it came to develop in the Renaissance, especially under the direction of Maximilian I, that, as you know, is the same guy who establishes the Landsknecht, and about whom I made a video. And that, however, follows has its ups and downs. At the beginning of the period, you see something that is not normally the hallmark of Habsburgic history. That is actually the fact that the imperial armies were well provided with artillery. Right, at the time of Emperor Maximilian, we count a particularly large park of artillery that and also an updated one technologically that reflects the great political effort and investment that the Habsburgs had made in their quest for further expansion in during the Italian wars. Because of the Protestant Reformation, though, Maximilian and his grandson Charles V are a bit the great defeated, or at least witness an important decline of the dynasty, especially in the second half of the 16th century, shrank further in its assets, notoriously also in the first half of the 17th, to which we stopped. The Habsburgs were chronically short of money. So when we look at Germany, actually, and of course they were the greatest power, but when we compare it to other during this couple of centuries, we realized that they had some important trouble. And during the 30 Years' War, essentially, you have an artillery shortage. That's something that the Habsburgs managed to compensate, in part also thanks to Wallenstein, towards the end of the war. But things would not improve, as you know, as we've seen also in the videos about surrounding the siege of Vienna 1683 until pretty late, right in the times, basically with Prince Eugene and Maria Theresia's reform. That's something that we will see hopefully in another video. There is the famous Weisskönig biography of the Emperor Maximilian that describes this talented young prince capable of handling artillery pieces with greater precision. I made some videos about 15th century artillery in its types, how they were developing at that point. Here also others on the general cost of artillery during the Renaissance, that they put an enormous logistical strain, but the art of war was evolving to a degree that, especially against the thickly packed pike square formations, artillery could create horrendous gaps, and we will see what in fact the deployment was in advanced position to achieve this, with all a series of doctrinal and also technical consequences for that matter. Always remember, doctrine makes tactics, not technology. Right? Technology does, but just for a minimal part. In any case, the Weisskönig is illustrating the effort that Maximilian made, also in the broader organization. Was important for Maximilian, that was trying essentially to concentrate power to original dimension that the Habsburgs were trying to accomplish after the initial disgregation of the so-called princely phase of the country. Make recently some videos about how the 14th, 15th century German principalities had made this great effort to constitute some provincial domains, and now the Habsburgs were, thanks to their monopolization of the Holy Roman Imperial title, were now about to succeed. Had it been because of fact, different questions. The same Reformation was also a reaction to that, but the same 30 Years' War later was so the actual victory. I mean, initially the war was de facto won by the Habsburgs before, in fact, the Danes, the Swedes entered the game. In any case, the main purpose at the end of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century, for a ruler like Maximilian was not just updating his military to the one of the great monarchies of Europe, but in this sense also investing in an estate that was essentially the communal one, essentially arming large amounts of subjects, right, that with pike and shot would arrive to challenge the same nobility that was, of course, the most resistant to the Habsburgic attempts of centralization. This thing fails in a way or another. We have witnessed it through the history of the Landsknecht, and that, yes, are an enormous page in not just in military but in social history for what they really meant in Germany. The fact of these coloners being armed, right, in a country that had basically always been lorded over by, in fact, feudal aristocracy. But in a system, in fact, that would not allow for further expansion. It was a problem also in other countries, or at least, for example, the French establishment prevented the affirmation of a native infantry. I made a video about this topic. Basically, France lost the Italian wars because of this, because otherwise they had essentially the largest potential as far as that was concerned. So artillery too was not really per se an anti-cavalry weapon, but of course gunpowder technology and this sort of think about Chevalier Bayard or what Ariosto sings, etc. It is really a weapon of the devil, right? It's mocked. It belongs to the lesser elements of society. It's not chivalrous. It's blind. It's evil, and there is all a literature about this. We will talk about it surely at some point. And it was important for Maximilian to show his commitment politically to this. That's the reason why, for example, he went dressed up as a pikeman at a point among his soldiers, and why, according to the same Weisskönig, he was himself more experienced, allegedly, than the best master gunners of his day, right? We know from the same source that the young Maximilian achieved a new technical superiority in one of the first organized systems of ordnance. So it's quite a fascinating idea. One of the most powerful rulers of his time, like descending to some levels of technical and social lowness, if you want, that, however, were to point towards the new direction that the country had to take. Maximilian was equally invested, of course, in the production process of these guns. For example, he ordered the new pieces to be made at the factories of Beck at Augsburg and of Sattler at Nuremberg, together with the best scientific insights of the time. It was important, for example, to create, as we'll see now, a different range of artillery in order to ensure some tactical flexibility, increasing the efficiency of combined arms. Initially, you have these lighter bronze pieces, their calibers being bored out, which suggests actually the capacity of using these in a sort of at a closer range with more interaction with the other arms. We see for the first time the barrels being carried on carriages, among the other things, whereas earlier they had been carried on separate wagons, which suggests yet another functionalization for a readier tactical employment. Trunnion and elevating mechanisms become more frequent. Also, new types of shot are being developed. may seem banal, but actually for the time it was a big deal. The shot passed from being prevalently stone to prevalently of iron. That later cannonballs are essentially cast iron, very high specific weight. We will see the different types of shot later for the 30 years war period, but the essential types were already present, developing at this point. Consider one aspect that Germany, together with Italy, is the most technologically advanced country in Europe today. As you know, the Germans pioneer, for example, the will-lock pistol mechanism. They have a lot of things that was incidentally stemming from, for example, the clockwork technology that the Germans were pioneering. There were lots of things going on in terms of adapting to the new circumstances, not necessarily like the richest countries, the most technologically advanced. Machiavelli noted the importance of the shot in the arsenals of the German towns, whose military organization he praised. There is definitely an internationalization of science, of knowledge, and more that here is, employed ad hoc by a quasi-doctrinal design. There is a very interesting source that is Freisleben, the keeper of the Holy Roman Imperial Arsenal, recording the two major types of cannon which Maximilian himself was attributed to have constructed. We will see how, in fact, these types at some point standardized into others by the time of the 30 Years' War. I made recently a video about the myth in the increase of firepower in those centuries that, of course, did occur and was also impressive in many ways, but not to the point that you can say even during the 30 Years' War, firepower being, of course, the decisive element. In fact, the pike was still around for a reason, right? The fact that it could not be worn out even when advancing, not just against arquebuses and muskets, but actual cannons that, as we were saying, we will see better now, were literally deployed in the front to cause this massacres. However, going back to Freisleben, we have these four types basically that are the Hauptbüchsen. These were the heavy siege guns, right? That were essentially massive barrels mounted at an angle on wooden supports with many rows of shoring behind the barrel. That, of course, was pretty effective measure. Very rough, but also only way actually to take the shock from the massive recoil. Handling these guns was actually very dangerous, especially during the early period. You know how many overheated and exploded during the operations. A Scottish king, as you know, died during a siege because of this. And when we look at the Hauptbüchsen, we realize that, of course, they were so massive that just the rate of fire was insanely low. It took literally hours to load. But siege warfare of the time was well calibrated, of course, for the type of fortresses. Now the Trace Italienne is coming around. And these main pieces, as it had been the case for medieval artillery, were, of course, necessary together with the many others we will see now that would have complementary role and or others, for example, accompanying the troops during the assaults, etc. There were also, and notoriously, protective shields, at this point quite sophisticated, for example, with a pivot on a frame that would be placed in front of the cannon and only raised on firing, so that crossbow bolts and an actual arquebuses shot would not harm the crew. Of course, if you took a cannonball on it, that this thing would fly into pieces. but it was also a way to hide what was going on, like catching the enemy by surprise, given that like normally the shot was regular, but the very moment which would rise the frame and you would take the shot could take the enemy by surprise in that way if you hit what was happening behind. The most famous example of such monster cannons was the so-called Mad Meg of Ghent, the city of Charles I. By the way, the Flemish cities of the Burgundian inheritance of the Habsburgs had been already, during the French government, some of the best providers of firearm technology, because the Flemish had developed a lot of that during the Middle Ages, to no avail, actually, because they were beaten savagely and repeatedly, basically almost throughout the entire 14th and 15th century by the same French Burgundian feudal armies that they had initially defeated at Courtrai. But in fact, it was about putting together the finest. In this case, well, as we were just saying, all the various towns and cities had their own guns, so they were necessary for their protection. There wasn't much of a difference in terms of attacker, defender, and siege warfare. The new military architectures were helping in fitting, of course, guns also for in defense, even though, of course, the defender was normally outnumbered because fortresses were just quite easily defendable, even with smaller garrisons. But here it's about also the bourgeois mentality, like the idea that you want to be in this affirmation of the Ancien regime post 14th century crisis, like you want to entrench yourself in your own community. You don't want to sort of go out. You have a defensive, inward sort of attitude, and you would load yourself with guns, which would sort of do, which is not right. Having a regional army capable of strategically relevant campaign operations, yet you provide what you have as a community to your lord, and this is the case. Speaking of this Mad Meg of Ghent, her barrel was 5.5 meters long. It had a bore of 83 centimeters and a weight of 15 tons. Right? It took 30 horses to pull the piece. So of course these were unusual guns, again created by these burghers to show off, to prove how powerful and important their city was, also politically within the Habsburgic domains. But surely they were employed as well. They would have another type of, however smaller, heavy artillery. Here it's difficult to categorize on the base of terminology because, as you know, we are in pre-Linnean times. We talked about this very much in our medieval history videos. In fact, especially about the ones about artillery and not just the gunpowder one. And there were these different terms. For example, the Schafmetze, the Nachtigall, the longest short Kartaune. This were considered the royal cannons of some sort. The Rotbüchse. These were essentially longer pieces, however they had a smaller caliber compared to the Hauptbüchse, and that's basically the trend, at least as far as especially anti-fortification weapons was concerned. This naturally allowed more precision and just allowed you to place them just as this individually in different, more easily in different positions. When we look at the barrels / caliber proportion in length, we have something like from 5 to 8.5 times, right? So substantially long. There was a reinforcement above the firing chamber to minimize the gas dispersion during the explosion, but for this very reason, in fact, strengthening the wall structure, prevent the piece to blow up entirely during firing. Then you had sort of smaller, sort of medium artillery that definitely had a more tactically dynamic employment, also in open field. The Schlangen. Now, the term Schlang is similar to the one of Serpentine. This guns type would be better defined as culverin in this case. There was also the Basilisk. In fact, there were pieces of different dimensions. This was completely normal. Sometimes it was more the actual design that mattered, the actual proportions that fit a piece in a certain lexical category, rather than at some point even the tactical employment per se. I mean, there are not so many things that a cannon can do per se, and all the various. We're far from standardization. We are in pre-industrial times. Again, every community brings what fundamentally they have. There is an attempt at standardization. That's always the great challenge of the pike and shot era, but not only. When we look at these medium artillery, we see the length of the barrel usually being 20 or 40 times its width, right? So ever more precise, albeit overall smaller. Also, the musket historically derives from a mobile artillery rather than a handgun, right? Then eventually these, it's a bit like, think about the ballistas and the crossbows. At some point in between, there is no difference, right? And you just tell me what's the standard you want to use. And so you can imagine these weapons used to some important degree, even for sniping, right? During sieges, like to dislodge some enemies from a very specific position, but also on the battlefield. They could be quite composite. Maximilian is also credited with the construction of siege mortars that he ordered specifically. These were particularly important because of the more indirect fire, the more parabolic, say accentuated parabolic trajectory. But there were at this point still various types of guns, such as the organ and grape ones. We do not even know too much how these ones used by the imperial forces were specifically built as it's normal, right? Unless you have some specific manuscript or indication. The makers of these pieces, again, were not just masters of their own art, and they had their own preferences and customizations, but at this point we will see how costly artillery was, and for this reason the makers were pledged to secrecy. The enemy was not meant to know what kind of technologies, models, at least they were experimenting with, right? It may seem laughable compared, say, to today's times and sort of normal technological disparity, but it was a way to, to increase even the psychological effect around the mystique, the secrecy that existed from the traditional world about these smiths, their arts, their sort of Teutonic, again, telluric secrets that could even take down the whitest, the most Apollonian of knights. Thanks to these investments rather than innovations, Maximilian managed to put together not less than 105 pieces of varying size. There was an imperial control on, in fact, the royal arsenals in Germany that were to be financed and manned. You had to find the right technicians, etc. And there was a large business behind that. In fact, this body of artillery technicians was organized on trade guild lines, making a lot of sense. We will see now how there wasn't even a precise distinction between the civilian technician, right, engineer, and the military crewmen of these guns. The modern era, of course, makes a lot in increasingly distinguishing, specializing, and professionalizing the crewman, the master gunner from the rest of those who had, for example, to pull the gun itself, the saddler train connected with it. We will see it in a while. But it's relevant how, of course, there was an enormous background. Just the other day we were talking about medieval guilds regarding the latter's logistical, technical, material capacities that at Maximilian's court, of course, were embodied by some important bourgeois figures that the emperor again needed for financing this incredibly expensive enterprise, and that were a bit also that attempt of anti-nobiliar emancipation that the monarch wanted to achieve, right? Speaking of this age, it seems that the color schemes of the artillery were tending towards a sort of standardization, at least for the imperial forces. The carriage was, for example, always painted in black. The metal fittings were red. Apparently, this may have had to do with some aspects of the same imperial banner, from which also like the colors of the modern German flag stem from. The wheels seem to have been left in their natural color, but you have to think really that at this point, even armor was lacquered at some point. Everything was extremely colorful, as we've seen in those videos. Well, that was the apotheosis of it, for example, of the Landsknecht and the rest. There was a wooden box placed often over the firing chamber to keep it dry, crucial enough, during especially transportation of the powder. And a small flag or pennant was put over the gun to just mark to which regiment it belonged to. This was normally inserted in the trade leg on the left-hand side, which sort of mimicked even normally how standard bearers would pick this flags with the left and defending them with the right. Considering the enormous size of some artillery piece, especially the siege one, a massive supply train was required, and this came together with a lot of other field aids, just all those who had to support the same troops, the masters, the technicians, all the items, the spare pieces, right? That say that this cannons had a tendency, of course, of damaging themselves pretty quickly at this point. We have an interesting source from Franz Berger. We are in 1566, estimating the exact composition of a train of 130 artillery pieces, which included specifically 100 field guns. So a massive park of the ones the Habsburgs still at this point could afford, even though with enormous expenses we will see now. So hear this, because it's insane, right? This makes you realize also how more complicated to some extent war had become, also because of artillery, and so how much bigger coordination was needed, in part from medieval times. Not excessively. I have something going on with my research comparing how, in fact, for example, early 14th century armies were normally larger than 16th century ones, right? But the latter had more artillery, so one has to consider how much was invested, transformed, how much absolute growth had occurred in spite of this relative rearrangement. But here, for 130 artillery pieces, we have the insane amount of 2,675 horses, 891 carters. Then you had, well, these were just for the organization, a few 5 Geshermeister, that is those officers entrusted with the handling of the management of the piece's transportation proper. You had 124 master gunners, the Büchsenmeister, that if you consider 130 pieces, 100 field guns here were basically one per cannon. They had to watch it operating. 63 ammo carriers, importantly enough. Then 4 Fähnlein of sappers. The Fähnlein were essentially some company units, normally making up, in fact, with like the standard organic of, for example, the regiment, and that normally was 1,000 men, but given, and I made multiple videos on this, the chronic understrength of the army is something around 500 at best, right? Considerably less most times. But this was not really a military unit, right? These Fähnlein were so it would make something like 2,000 people, right? And most of these were taken from the actual saddler train. So we're talking sometimes women, children. These were to just assist the men. They were often the same families of the soldiers. There were a bit like lots of different people, prostitutes, merchants, criminals, just people who were there for the loot, things like that. But they would do, right? And they were organized again also in some sort of corporative way. Just the way the units were contracted, by whom, which connections they had clienterally, and whatever. Then you had 200 Schneller, which literally means faster, or those who have to be faster. That predictably are the loaders, right? That were often provided with an artisanal background of some sort. They, of course, needed to know how the guns operated. They had to be careful, like with the timing, controlling that they wouldn't overheat, that things could go well. So all these people were eventually to make the guns operate on the field and on moving on campaign especially. And it was sometimes an incredibly thankless job. And here there is no, let's say, way to digress on the actual pays, just in terms of like the individual specialties, etc. But you understand that such an enormous amount of men, of horses, was corresponding also to a very high expense, because artillery had become that relevant, right? It's already from the 20s of the 15th century that an updated European prince cannot do without an artillery park of some sort. And at this point we're talking countries basically that owe their survival to the capacity of meeting in open field an enemy with, say, conventional warfare, right? There were also other 100 wagons bringing other ammo, equipment of some sort, against spare power, everything that could be needed. Even just think about the transportation of what they had to invent themselves, for example, to cross some passes or very tough terrain. If you read of the French expedition of Charles VIII into Italy in 1494, like across the Apennines, it was really, insane in many ways. The entire army was delayed because of the massive cannons that the French had brought. They were quite useful. I mean, the Italian cities at that point let just the French pass, right? And very few would dare resist against their firepower. But still, there was another cost, still strategically and logistically, especially in the speed of the army. But evidently, that much the guns were needed. These other 100 wagons came also with some other 400 horses, 150 men, right? As I often say, horses consume a shockingly traumatic amount of fodder, of water, and just in logistical terms, it's a nightmare to think here we're speaking of more than 3,000 horses just for carrying, well, of course, an enormous size of 100 guns that normally you don't find, in fact, in these armies in the first place. I mean, this list is just an ideal to an extent, right? But all that firepower was, as we will see now, just a mirage, even during the 30 Years' War, most of the time, especially in the heat of the campaign, how it had dragged on and had, of course, significantly depleted all sources available. There is the shocking total, considering the pay in gulden, of almost 43,000 guilders a month for paying all these people and for all this material, which is a pretty large amount. I mean, here, if you compare like the broader income of the say what the Habsburgs could neatly get into their hands, we're talking about a significant fraction of the entire expenses. We're talking things like 1/10, even 1/3. It depends, right? Of probably what was available for a given campaign. It naturally of this size would not come frequently at all, nor, I mean, you would have had to recover for other years for this expense. Consider just the cannon price as well. Franz Belger actually does give us an example of such bill, right? Just to make you understand, first of all, the like 43,000 gulden are something like 100 kilos of gold a month, right? A gold is something like 2.5 grams of gold. But you have, for example, for a Nachtigall, meaning nightingale in German, as we've seen before, one of the heavy artillery types, 60 hundredweight of metal, including weight for caster. This was almost 1,100 florins. Then the gun cradle, including wood, metal attachments, also weight for the construction, 80 florins. The carriage, 150. Limber, 24. Limber spike, 5. Chains, 5. Right, 2 sets of wheels for the limber and the carriage, 10 florins. Ladle, sponge, matchlock, etc., 2 florins, for a total of 1,356 florins, which is essentially something a bit more than a gold, and basically the same, the equivalent. And this is a considerable sum. Like, for example, like a couple of 100 years before, like with that you could buy maybe like a village with that. So these costs, as you understand, are massive. They are as structural as they get in terms of public administration, taxes, etc. This brought unavoidably, in order just to fit the guns, to have them operating, continuous and systematic looting of the enemy cities, starting from the ones that were captured after the bombardment, right? The Oberster Zeugmeister, that was the Master General of the Ordnance, having the same rank of a field marshal, had the greatest responsibility of being the only to decide how to employ the entirety of the artillery. Like, its unity of command was particularly relevant, as much as the one of the ammo, right? So there had to be a strategically punching and single-handed employment of this artillery. Of course, they say this guy could entrust command of different pieces in different parts of the theater, but he was solely responsible for that. He had the sole right to dispose of the entirety of the arm, right? And was also entitled for this reason to all the spare material at the end of the campaign. He could pick, for example, all the arms and armor of the troops that came together with all of this. Within the artillery itself, but of course, these guys were armed to some extent. He only had to respond to the Kriegsherr, so the supreme commander of the army during the campaign, whoever he was, obviously commanding the whole army, but this Master General of the Ordnance at the head of artillery was so important that he sort of had no other commander, no other medium, no other officer between him and the commander-in-chief. Right. There was also of course, a delegation of power. For example, the master gunners were entitled to all the powder and shot equally. So this was to just refine the efficiency down the line by rewarding these guys and making sure that at least they would maintain a significant amount of ammo present in their units, at least up to the end of the campaign. You can imagine the level of speculation that existed even just in contracting all these people, but at least initially they would have to field these forces. There was all the practices we were saying, predatory recycling of material that would come in the hands of the artillerists. For example, the church bells, right? They were ideal to recast into gun barrels. Those of the Schatzmeister, or engineers, essentially those deputed to the construction of trenches and other fortifications, holding a rank equal to the one of captain, were put in command of the Schanzbauer, that were, as you understand, Schanz here stands for the trench. You have the Meister and the Bauer. So these were essentially some sappers of sort, commanded by these guys, and their task was literally to strip the houses and any other building they found of the wood for constructing earthworks. As we have seen, guns need ever more these emplacements. The fortifications have an ever lower profile, that the guns have to be lodged into some specific entrenchments. You had finally the aforementioned Geschirrmeister, that were officials entrusted with the task of literally moving the guns. Then you had the Zeugwacht, who commanded the train as well as the arsenal movement per se. So you understand, even from the hierarchy behind the military organization, how much effort was put in order to render as efficient as possible the movement of this massive amount of material. You had also the artillerymen. We will see better like a typical equipment, especially of the 17th century ones that are better documented. But the interesting aspect of these crewmen is that they were considered essentially as a special type of Landsknechten, as their pay that was in fact equal to that level of soldier proves. An optimally trained master gunner was paid something between 8 and 16 guilders. He was so after, however, just in the incumbents of the battle, right? The attempt was, of course, given how precious this personnel was, not to pay it for an unnecessarily long amount of time. And this also shows you how ad hoc sometimes the recruitment happened, and how in general these people gravitated around the army in a way or another. The Schneller, the loaders, were also particularly well paid in relative terms, 6 guilders a month, so actually twice more than the average Landsknecht. which again is not what you would think necessarily, but of course the artillerists had some greater technique. It was also, as we will see now, a potential career path that these guys were going under, because through their, for example, mathematical and engineering skills, they could hope to serve at higher ranks, right? So the average rank and file pikeman of the Landsknechten was not comparing really in the bigger picture overall. The strength of the pike squares was their mass, not much the individual per se. Franz Berger says, by the way, that the crewmen were recompensated with extra pay and privileges in order to maintain their positions during the battle, which was a pretty risky business. We will explain now why. They were not really allowed to take part in the ensuing plunder, probably not much because of the let's say of the expense in itself, but the fact that they could get themselves lost, right, somewhere that could not be traced, where the enemy could counterattack, and they were too precious to risk, right? So this speaks actually of a privilege, of an immunity, right? Even from figures like the provost, the cannon was in itself considered a symbol of liberty. For example, like the church, right, in the army is something crazy if you think about that. If you wanted to seek asylum and justice, you could flee to a cannon, and basically also because of the presence of these people that, as we've seen, were a bit like the symbol of a sort of social emancipation, just like the Landsknechten, they would be protected. They would be taken under the wing of these troops that had such privilege and that could speak to sort of the higher ranks more easily, right? The gunners' wives were allowed to form their own train. It's that important that the artillerist rises this point in history. Not overall, and this is specific of German armies to an extent, in part because of this intertwinement with the Landsknechten and the general actual failure, in trying to attract even more these individuals that, as we've seen, entailed enormous costs, and so you had to at least incentivize in the first place people to come there, and luring them with certain privileges that would make, even for the difficulties of actually providing with their pay, which, as you know, was always a problem. It was a problem in Vienna, it was a problem in Rome, it was all about getting the damn money. And these guys, even in the best of cases, would at some point leave a miserable career as much as the rest of their life, because there wasn't too much to actually save in the whole process. But there was also another reason why these guys were so well treated, because they had an incredibly risky tactical mansion. In fact, the artillery, as we will see now, was deployed in the front of the host, right? And as such, these people were dramatically exposed to the enemy. There was a practice at a point, you see, in defense, the idea was that the enemy square had to advance and you had to shoot him, and then if the enemy pikes arrived to the guns, it was possible just to leave the guns there, because they were quite heavy and difficult to handle, to wield in the first place. And these crewmen were tasked in sort of pulling out, taking away the ammo, all this stuff. But this still means that they were exposed in the first line even to sharp shooting. And given their technical skills and how, in fact, important they were as, in fact, craftsmen, technicians, etc., they were normally camouflaged, right, ante litteram. At this point, nobody really camouflaged. There was not much of a reason to do so, but they were not, say, fighting troops. They didn't have to show off to be particularly, needed to in combat in the first place, but they could be targets for the enemy sharpshooters who would definitely take down an important amount of enemy assets by killing these guys. So the artillerists would wear green, brown, right? So to literally be less identifiable, even just in front of the whole enemy army, which was just a precarious way of trying to limit, of course, the risk, but so it was. There was a true statute with articles that regulated the artilleryman right, that was in fact to be administered by the Master General of the Ordnance we've seen before. So any disciplinary issue passed through the guy, and these guys were to be protected under that law, so they had some sort of solidarity among one another, as we've seen in the video about the Langsknechten, was basically functioning in the same way. I just list the battle plan of 1532 against the Turks, when the German army was based on 3 large blocks, with the cavalry operating in the 2 gaps. Then you have 20,000 quote nimble arquebusiers, 5 ranks deep, located before and behind the pikes, interestingly enough, and the artillery of all sizes deployed in the front of the formation, which is basically what remains roughly throughout the entire period here, and also during the 30 Years' War for the aforementioned reason. The main objective was to cause this enormous damage to the thickly packed heavy infantry, advancing also the one at distance. Of course, there would be artillery deployed even from the offender, shooting also over the heads of the same troops that had advanced in the meanwhile. Now we will see by the first half of the 17th century what type of shots were around, then we will pass to the types of crewmen and their equipment, right? It's just worth spending a note briefly about the development of Habsburgic artillery during from the time of Charles V and the 30 Years' War, because after Maximilian and during, say, the peak at least of Habsburgic power, definitely have an important artillery availability. Maximilian has surely set some trends, as you know, also in armor style and also in the beauty, literally, of cannons. There was also style associated with functionality, right? Nothing standard, as we were saying. But after the reign of Charles V, as things start to go a bit downhill, also financially speaking, and by the time of the 30 Years' War, you realize that artillery has not made a dramatic advancement in, say, the general ratio of firepower compared to the heaviness of infantry. That is basically the size of arm at this point. I made some videos about the staticization of siege warfare during this time, all the implications for artillery development as well. If you go in the modern warfare playlist, you will find everything. And you realize that in 1618 you have basically the same type of cannons that would have existed at the time of Charles V, conceptually. The Kartauner, these were essentially 11-12 pounders. The half and full Kartauner that were respectively 24-25 and 48-50 pounders. These had a range of respectively like 450-750 paces, which is something like 400-700 meters roughly. Then you have the Schlange, the snakes, including half falconets. We're talking half to 1 pounder. The falconets proper from 4 to 6 pounders. The 8, the quarter and the half, as well as the full Schlange, and respectively we're talking 6 to 8, 11 to 12, 20 to 25, and 48 to 50 pounders. This had a range of 120 to 100 paces, roughly, again, something like 80 to 150 meters. There is, of course, an evolution during the 30 Years' War. In the 30s of the 17th century, you should have basically been able to see an important standardization in the calibers manufacturing. This had just been pushed by also the tactical, the doctrinal, if you want, simplification of artillery employment. There would be an 8th cannon, 6 pounders a quarter, one of 12, and a Deming cannon of 24. There were surely many older pieces, especially in the most backward states in Germany, that were mostly Protestant, and more of that coming, by the way, because I'm making some videos soon about this topic. But of course, like all the various German cities, for example, and their arsenals had sometimes old pieces that would do. We find quarter cannons of 10, 12, 14, 60 pounders. So again, everything was far from complete standardization, but there is some level of achievement, especially, in fact, in the imperial armies that were not just coming mostly from the richest parts, so the most advanced parts of Germany, but also for this reason could afford like a general, more concentrated command, right? So greater order, discipline, and more, right? Nevertheless, the Holy Roman Imperial Army was defective in the amount, especially the quality to some extent, of guns compared to broader European standards, right? The war in Germany was messy, to say the least. It had devastated the country, and just the bigger scheme of the campaigns, of the strategies required some say not lighter way of traveling, but surely there were less resources available. It was just important to put together what you could. There wasn't too much available just to be perfect, to be fully equipped, whatever. This is different from other countries that sort of have it relatively easier, for example Sweden, and we will have to talk specifically about Gustavus Adolphus' artillery. We made multiple videos about the infantry. We still have to cover in detail the cavalry and talk about his reforms, but he had been in fact financed by France. Sweden had also a lot of iron that would start also exporting, so there was something tidier, sort of more concentrated in that case. It is not to say that the Swedes wouldn't also go out to war in sort of more precarious ways during the peak of the cruelty of their campaign. It would reach as far as Bavaria, but in general you can see this Habsburgic way of war. At the beginning of the war, for example, Dampierre Corps deployed around Krem had only 3 cannons, interestingly enough. Tilly at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631 had only 7 Halfkartauner, 3 Schlange, and 2 Falconets. Things started to improve under Wallenstein, that, as you know, was a hell of a businessman, and just secondarily, but also lent to that service also good commander. His army was well equipped because he had put an enormous care in the organization of the same, finance from his large estates, and as you know, the guy was aiming to even sort of unify Germany under his potential crown of sort. That reason why it was taken out by the Holy Roman Emperor in the end. And there was a lot that, in fact, other imperial commanders would borrow, let's say, from the same Wallenstein's park. For example, the Duke of Friedland took some guns from the dukes and princes in those territories he found himself, so this was a normal practice of some sort. In 1632, Wallenstein's train had at least 44 cannons, 280 artillerists, which speaks, as if you remember the proportions, was essentially 1-to-1 in Renaissance times, of course, of the development of artillery, after all, from a technical point of view, the maintenance, the sort of, science needed to handle them. 151 Haiduks, these were Hungarian and Serbian irregulars that were particularly useful, a bit like the so-called dragoons in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Army, acting as pioneers, guards, people who would pave the way to the same artillery and would be able to fence off potential danger. Something like 1,800 horses, all resources that were still normally hired, sometimes openly looted, together with the same drivers from the civilian communities, or the so-called civilian. Again, the difference is still, by the time of the 30 Years' War, is between a civilian and a military man is not that cleanly outlined. After the Treaty of Westphalia, of course, you would have the sort of attempt of diversifying further, but because of also the extent of these requisitions, the time is also in friendly territory, and of course Central Europe was a mess, as you know, different jurisdiction of boundaries, and an incredibly complicated set of allegiance that for which, say, these leaders didn't even have too much time. And if you look at Wallenstein artillery organization, you see that he was approaching the Swedish model in some sense, as he was at least making an effort to provide each infantry unit with 2 light guns, the so-called short barrel ones that, as we've seen in the Swedish army, were the fruit of an increased combined arms capacity. In the case of Wallenstein, we're talking about 6-pounders. Again, this imperial force would not be able to reach the Swedish levels, but it was still the most advanced available, and especially thanks to this business model, just the availability. It's not that, there are peoples that are stupid and others that sorted out all before and then they win wars like that. Everything was much more leveled, and it was primarily also a matter of availability of resources. The numbers we listed before were also the ones that Wallenstein could just employ in his broader power, but not the ones that literally an imperial army would field at every time. The highest number of guns employed in a single battle occurred at Nördlingen, 1634, when the Emperor Ferdinand III had under his command 34 heavy and 116 light pieces. This being, in fact, an enormous effort that would not be replicated by the Imperials after this during the war. Right. So when we look at the improvements, let's say from a doctrinal and tactical and technical point of view, we definitely realize from the hints scattered here and there that artillery had grown in importance, not just in warfare in general, but also in the tactical employment in open field. Right, open field guns had been used since the 100 Years' War. Think about the Battle of Crécy, those early bombards with small effect, right, if not just a psychological one of novelty back in the day. And still, by the time of the 30 Years' War, actually, artillery was not overwhelmingly important or effective in the broader economy of forces on the battlefield. Surely it was performing, it had a purpose, but it was mostly connected to some, lucky shots that could take lots of people out on a single circumstance, rather than overall, like, statistically making this greater butchery, right? For example, at the Battle of Rhine, during the crossing of the Lech in 1632, you find the massed Swedish artillery destroying the Catholic League's army in its own camp, right? And this had been an important victory of Gustavus Adolphus over TE that was finally destroyed like this. But the broader, and it's an exception though, right? In open field, the main purpose was to just shatter the enemy, primarily from a psychological point of view. The casualties, the actual kills of artillery would not be ever actually more important until the Napoleonic Wars, for example, compared to the musketry fire, cold steel, right? There was also a lot of, say, difficulty in actually making it an accurate arm in the first place, because of the general mess, like the lack of clear visuals, the actual difficulty in the spaces, as we've seen here. Artillery acted a bit like it was deployed in the front, right? So without too much general concern, even for the possibility of losing this, or pulling out of the battle with it, right? Of course, there was some artillery deployed in the rear of the formations as well, and this trend was increasing. But fundamentally, other arms were more important. There were some battles, like the one at Dessau Bridge in 1626, the aforementioned Nördlingen as well, when, for example, some ammo wagons were hit by artillery, and the explosion actually taking out lots of people, and especially disordering the army. This was just one of the conveniences. The main problem of artillery, however, lacked in the fact that it was not maneuverable enough. It was pretty heavy. Once you had placed the 6, 12, and 24 pounders on the battlefield, you had to leave them there during combat. We're talking about dozens of pieces at this point, regularly. So definitely their employment has increased importance, but still the tactical maneuverability has not been deemed even as relevant, given that there was a reason, the fact that, again, the pike square was still there, so that was also pretty slow, bulky, and as long as it was there, it was the decisive arm. You didn't need to hurry up with other arms more than much, and that's why essentially you have to wait linear warfare for a full dynamization of artillery employment, right? And also that took a while, right? So we're definitely not in that time yet. These guns also fire slowly still, and they would do so regularly during the engagement, but the main hits were scored at the beginning of the battle, right? Because eventually the infantries, mostly cavalry, had to confront themselves exactly along the same line, basically where artillery was deployed. So at some point, again, the crews gave up on the guns entirely. In the first place, there was already the mitraille, and so you couldn't quite even just run with a pike square to avoid that. But unitary firepower in itself was not enough, even through these horrendous bloodshed at close range to simply wipe out the heavy infantry. So that's how war goes, quite simply. And as we will see now, there are quite nasty type of projectiles involved. Right, there is an effort in the standardization of calibers. Definitely, the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic League, definitely begin. This essentially starts at the regimental level by employing, as we've seen also with Wallenstein, some guns that were very often not there. Like they had fewer just on paper than what the Swedes use, or at least also in their case, falling short numerically, but still consider what we said in our videos about the 30 Years' War, that tendentially the Catholics can afford still using larger contingents, which is not actually a proof of weakness just per se. And so they would rely more on the pike squares. Artillery, proportionally to that, as we've seen, did not matter equally, right? So it's not much a matter of backwardness or simple lack of means, because at least in Germany, again, the Catholic forces were the better ones, right? Aside from these foreign elements such as the Swedes, that were a bit the let's say the exception. In that the Protestant Germans had actually much less means, were less technological, but just also less developed from a military point of view. And in fact, they would suffer dramatic losses at the hands of these Catholic counterparts. In any case, from 1633, there was this at least objective of providing with say 2 guns per regiment, with also the purpose of increasing the synergy with the musketeers' volleys. So in other words, here artillery had to contribute with a certain tempo, like in synchrony, to the handguns, just to maximize again the damage in interest of time. The same amount of shots with the same amount of hits is much more devastating if shot at a single time than diluted across the time of reload, right? Because it's primarily the psychological impact that matters, right? Seeing those people dying all at once is much more devastating than seeing them dying exactly in the same amount of time between a shot and another, but diluted across it. So the guns would be normally dragged forward by their crews. The infantry advanced with them, because there was, of course, space, like just before the engagement, in which the shot would screen the advance of the same pikes. It had been initially so, and this helped to screen the same artillery that eventually stopped and began to shoot together with the handgunners. Of course, the old purpose of creating these horrendous gaps into the enemy pike squares had never ceased to be there. Like, the idea was to do this, as we've seen, in cooperation with the musketeers, and especially with cavalry that could close in, entering the gap, or at least starting to break the enemy from there, and hopefully making him rout, right? This was all a combined arm operation. That's why the Swiss were defeated at Marignano, because they found themselves in front of guns literally shooting into them without any other arm that could do anything at that point to save their skins. So you can imagine this, just a terrifying, gory situation. People, pieces flying all over, and these cannonballs maintaining a dramatic kinetic energy just by rolling on the grass and cutting people's legs as they were passing. So speaking of the shot types, by the 30 Years' War, that applies somewhat, however, to what already existed, say, in Maximilian's times, the good old solid ball smashing everything, or almost, at least anything leaving. Then you have canister shot, pretty nasty, but also not as consequential, if not at short range. Grenades, we'll see now all the, say, the technicalities of these types. You have the knife shot, which is actually something invented or at least developed in naval warfare to cut the enemy ship's riggings. Then you have hemispherical balls, chain shots, something a bit more exotic than the usual. So the standard would be, again, the solid ball made of cast iron, lead, stone. It could be reinforced with a circular band of metal. Canister was a metal box filled with a bit of everything, mostly iron bullets, just like the musketry ones, or scrap, whatever could harm. Grenades or shells had a power charge that essentially was detonated by a slow burning fuse. The thing was shot, the ball would literally smash like another. It was lighter than the full one, but if it fell among soldiers, it was not particularly pleasant. And then it sort of fizzed a bit on the ground, and then it exploded. Like, you have all this, I don't know, think about War and Peace, Prince Andrei, demise, etc. Like, this is a technology that lasts for centuries, as a matter of fact. It was effective, of course, as far as you could sort of, again, even beyond physical damage, tearing people to pieces. It was just like the shock effect psychologically. The hope to disorder the various lines that were, of course, conceived with a specific order of the individual men and their sort of characteristics in a battle line and file. The knife shot, as we were saying before, was mostly used at sea. It contained 4 sharp blades inside a solid ball that, however, would break once. Literally, the shot, like just after it came out of the muzzle, and it had mostly the purpose of cutting the riggings of the enemy sails, but it could have some application also in land warfare. The hemispherical projectiles instead consisted, in fact, of these 2 halves of a sphere that would spun apart, discharge, to form 2 distinct projectiles. Just a variation to make things messier at a slightly shorter range, but also less effective in general. Then there is the chain shot, so 2 balls chained by, in fact, this link, could be also interlocking sliding rods, eyelets, something like that. And the obvious purpose was just, at least if the shot was likely, just to cut everything with the chain, right, that would find in between the two, the pair, and this obviously was directed, as most of these shots, mainly against the pikemen. They were all well thickly compact. Again, there wasn't much reliance on these weapons just per se, but shattering the order of the formation, especially shooting at point blank, was particularly effective. Like, to destroy the first lines or even carry out some sort of ricochet fire that is the purpose of which is not hitting the enemy, it's actually disordering it, seeing the ball bouncing in front of you and just freaking out. And the first line that is made up by the man that every other soldier behind is trained to follow to maintain the cohesion of the formation can in fact have nefarious consequences. for this unit, right? There was all an important way to check the size of the projectiles in function of the gun caliber. There were different tools to measure that, such as gauge plates, rings, compasses, knotted ropes with marks, etc. There was also a distinct attachment to, as we'll see now better, that the broader craft, the broader, let's say, lifestyle of the gunman, of the artillerist. Historically, among the Catholic troops, Saint Barbara was the patron of the artillerist, as well as the one of the miners, and so all the, say, different troops involved in this sort of explosive business. This was displayed, for example, among the Catholic German guns with a cross sign at the muzzle of the same. This is really an important touch of color, because naturally it doesn't end with the guns, right? You have all kind of explosive business that these artillerists and or other, specialized units are involved in. As we were saying before, it's all a melange of knowledge, of skills. This is like the 30 Years' War. I made a video about Wallenstein's obsession for alchemy, for astrology, like for all this great scientific effort to sort out the world through these new combinations and ways to maximize the effects. Naturally, warfare was much more empirical and concrete, but the two fields intertwined. The way to blow up the enemy fortifications, gates, walls, was of course through mining, carried out by the placing of a small bomb, de facto called a petard, right? It was usually conical in a rough shape, also looking like a bell sometimes, was made of metal, similar to the canister, except it contained this large amount of explosives, normally something between, say, roughly around 2.5 kilos, detonated just like the grenade with a slow burning fuse. You could secure firmly the petard to wherever you had placed it, under, like at a gate or under a tunnel that you had mined under the enemy fortification. And the reason of the petard's shape stands in the, let's say, the type of direction that the explosion is gonna take on the base of this position. It essentially explodes, from the part, of course, in which the let's say in the opening part of the cone, right, to really concentrate in that direction. And you could have different variations in designs, of course, depending to the type of target that you wanted to blow up. There was naturally a lot of ingenuity regarding these things ad hoc to the type of of target. There were ways to nail the petard in wood, for example. If you think about support beams of gates or frames of of tunnels, for example, you could sort of find a way to fit it at best. And in general, this was a very risky business. It had a lot to do with artillery as well. Like the same people specializing in explosive, of course, were also skilled in artillery to some degree. As we were just saying, there wasn't such a thing like a true military specialty even in artillery, not just in explosives, right? The sense was that the people experts in this craft had been living in the world, and so both in the military and in the civilian contexts were blowing up things. Which, let's be honest, it's pretty damn fun. At least, till you don't blow up yourself, you get killed in some other way in the process. As we were saying before, these skills, however, needed, and also just the mathematical, the general practical knowledge that you would gain among the other things studying, for example, ballistics, or just all what involved, for example, the logistics of artillery, as we've seen, was very complex, could push you up in the hierarchy, in rank. Because it required really at some point a lengthy education, not just a practical experience, but a perfection in theory, which also entailed per se that you were literate, so that you had some interesting background that could be developed further in some higher rank. Right. In fact, there were officers really emerging more easily from these mansions that, as we've seen, were also just very sought after and prized. If you look, for example, of how artillery officers were paid, right, the gunners were definitely better off than infantrymen or even cavalrymen to some extent. And this was true also for the troop as well. But this came also with great responsibilities and with a harsh discipline. Never forget that this world is incredibly ruthless even among friends, and that while there is no such thing like a fully standardized disciplinary procedure, you would have some commanders being really exemplary, right, as harsh, right? It was completely normal to shoot people who fled on the spot, like great commanders we read about were perfectly doing so, just even as a mean to instill further courage, even the harsh way, and depending on the situation, right? This was also a matter of judgment. But there is an interesting incident occurring at the siege of Regensburg in 1634, where an artilleryman, after having failed to even hit an enemy tower 24 times in a row, 24 shots in a row, was hanged, right, for the shame, for his incapacity, which evidently was something that these armies could not afford, right, because 24 shots, especially considering how slowly these guns were still reloaded and all, like, meant an awfully long time with an enemy tower shooting back and killing people. So they made an example of this guy just by hanging him on the spot, which is, again, what the reality of the 30 years war and war in general is like. If we were to exemplify certain types of crewmen, we could distinguish basically between the captain, the guy who is essentially put as a senior gunner at the head of the crew, and the rest of the latter, right? The gun captain would be using during combat certain specific tools. There were weapons around as well, and as we've seen, it could happen that you had to abandon the same pieces just with the enemy at a very close range. But we can think of a gunner's spontoon with two match holders. Powder horn holding this fine-grained priming powder poured into and around the touch hole of the gun. The dark colors, as we've seen, allowed him to camouflage, but also to be more practical when handling gunpowder, considering that the gunners were often covered in this greasy black residues when firing, right? And he had, of course, a major responsibility in organizing the shot. Other gunners could have important devices, such as, for example, a triple-bladed artillery dagger, which could be used as a weapon, but also as a measure to measure the caliber of the cannon. There would be a ramrod, so essentially this metal wooden device used with muzzle-loading firearms to push the projectile up against the propellant. You would have different pieces, right? Not just one shaft, especially when it came to siege guns that required, as we've seen, sort of different care and condition during the employment. They were more complicated to use, and after all, there would be unstandardized pieces, so you had to find all, again, that from that set of tools that you would bring yourself with you, like the right one for the right gun that you may have not necessarily even tried to some extent. Maybe it was a captured piece, for example. It was very, artisanal, backward, old style. The practical functions are the same, but the way they operate to perfect the shot is and to make it more effective, and just reloading faster and handling it is another matter, right? There was a lot of practicality associated with the type of costume that the artillerymen could wear, especially in the incredibly pressuring combat situation. These guys got hot quite quickly. They would just have some shirt and breeches, nothing particularly heavier. The wet swab was used for damping out embers left in the bore after each shot, and for this reason it was often made of sheepskin that would preferably be nailed to the staff with brass nails, because when this entered the iron barrel, you could accidentally ignite some residuals by scraping and with some spark accidentally, and causing quite dangerous situations. All right. Powder in the 17th century was carried in loose sacks inside kegs on the battlefield. This was also very dangerous because you could ignite them accidentally. It had been dangerous enough until this point, actually having arquebusiers, musketeers being too close to one another, because if the bandoliers accidentally ignited, they could literally not just kill the person wearing them, but with the charges exploding, but also igniting the next guy along the line. So this had brought also to a sort of open order for what was, after all, a light infantry. Right. The scoops were usually made of brass. You would have also a lot of back and forth on the battlefield. Consider that the enemy shot was still, and I talk about this in the video about the firepower 30 years for, quite impractical, right? So you could be at close distance from the enemy without too much risk, after all. The heavy infantry was properly heavy. The troops did not especially want to come out of the pike square, because that would endanger the formation solidity. So it would have not been unusual to see, for example, civilian artillery drivers coming very close to danger, aside from the fact that, say, artillery would be employed in open field, as we've seen mostly in in batteries stationed in the front line. So these guys could arrive up to there, even just to replenish the ammo, and or bringing like banally water, food, something like that. But these guys could find themselves also into ambushes during the campaign out there, and just they were sort of militarized, as we've seen. It was the scum of the earth who belonged to these armies at large, and so these were all sort of shady dealers and brigands themselves, people carrying out sort of illicit activities, finding all these resources often just by mean of extortion, prey, etc. And so they were also militarized, right? They were used to violence, they were used to requisitions and use of brutal force at civilian, right? So there is nothing really to be surprised of. But in general, you could even have really an average guy picked from the near farm, like just to help you with some logistical things, just co-opted like that. And even though the guy would have surely seen violence in his lifetime, he could have been literally projected in this mess, right? And it's not until the second half of the 17th century that you find some sort of, and finally, properly military and sort of standardized logistical units that are for the first time designed just to say, okay, how much do we have to transport in the first place to the battlefield? Right? This is what the French of Louis XIV began to do so. And in a country like Germany until the 30 years, where everything was much more, let's say traditional. But of course, as we've seen, there was also an effort to organize further, to standardize, and this definitely does belong to more the imperial side, that after all was the more developed, the more advanced, the better organized, and so it depends also from army to army, from commander to commander. Wallenstein, great businessman, he knew how to make those things work, right? Even like logistically, even before militarily, right? But the things, of course, went in parallel to a great extent, and this is pretty much the picture. Very well, I'm glad we're talking about these topics. As you know, my point is to cover pretty much all the various arms of all the early modern armies. At some point, if we're gradually doing so, right? We talked a lot about also non-European armies, the Mughals, at least in part, the Ottomans. And so we're getting a bit closer to 16th, 17th century, probably Western Central European warfare, and let's really go on with this as much as we can. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.